Okay, I think let's go ahead and get started, and people can join us as we go through. The webinar is only 30 minutes, so I just hope to optimize as much of the time that we have together today. It is a pretty full house, so first of all, I just really want to thank everybody for taking the time to come to this webinar and hear more about the new book, The Art of Pharmacoeconomics. And so let's just go ahead and get started. So the format of today, during the time that we have together, is going to be, I will start just by giving you an overview of a couple of topics and talking about the book, and then we will open it up to the question and answer. So like I had mentioned before, if you do have any questions throughout, whether you came prepared with questions or if you have any questions of anything that I've mentioned or anything that I might have not covered in this short time, please put it in the Q&A and we will get to that after this section here. So for today, we're going to start talk about a little bit about the author, so myself, just to give you a little background. Some of you may know me, some of you may not. And then we're going to start talking more about the topic of pharmacoeconomics. We're going to start off with talking about resource scarcity and decision-making in general. And then we're going to talk about pharmacoeconomics. What is it? Some of you may be familiar with the topic. It might be something that you already work on or have trained in, but some are new to this topic as well. So we're going to just I'll provide a quick overview of what is it, how is it used, that type of thing. And then we'll dive in right away to talk a lot more about the book, who should read it, what are the different components, the sections and the chapters, and then how you can really use this. So I might pause a little bit just to look at different questions. But so what we're going to do is I will also look at the Q&A kind of throughout, but like I mentioned, we'll go through the content that I have planned, and then we'll address specific questions more towards the end, because sometimes it ends up I cover some of the questions during the presentation. So let's go ahead and get started with a brief introduction of myself. So my name is Rola Kaakeh. I am the author of The Art of Pharmacoeconomics. I am currently the CEO of Salus Vitae Group and adjunct faculty at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine here in Chicago. I am also affiliate faculty at the Institute for Global Health. So teaching is an integral part of what I enjoy and like doing. I am a fellowship trained pharmacist. I did do 2 years postdoctoral fellowship in pharmaceutical outcomes, pharmacoeconomics, and health services research. So it is an area that I have trained in formally in terms of as a postdoc fellow, but then have worked in that space for quite some time. In my current position, I advise a wide range of institutions, universities, corporations, as well as consultancy and professional associations, as well as NGOs and humanitarian organizations. So take much more of an advisory role in my current position, although I have about 15 years of experience in very different settings, whether it be academic, corporate, or pharmacy practice in general. So I definitely like to take a much wider healthcare perspective, public health perspective, kind of across the board with that. My areas of focus have been primarily national policies and looking at institution-specific initiatives. So when you hear me speak, I often talk about not just kind of patient-to-patient level interventions, but also those that are institutional and maybe even regional and country and kind of across the board there. So that's just a little bit about me. I basically have followed the spectrum of the learner to the educator to those that have actually implemented this type of work in practice. So as a student, whether you're a pharmacy student or in medicine or public health, you do take the topic of health economics and pharmacoeconomics within the curriculum, but then transitioning to the fellowship role, which was much more concentrated role. But then I also taught this subject at the university. So I did teach formal graduate level pharmacoeconomic courses. And so I say that just to say that I really noticed the breadth and where there's gaps and opportunities for learning this discipline in order to actively apply it within our decision-making process. But we'll talk about that in a bit. Now, if we talk about pharmacoeconomics in general, we have to start out with where the need falls. And much of the focus of this topic, or really the necessity for looking at pharmacoeconomics or the economic side of healthcare is on the topic of resource scarcity and decision-making in general. If we look at our current realities meaning what we basically have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, we have limited finite resources. So resources aren't endless, regardless of where you are. And I know this really differs in terms of your accessibility resources based off where you are in the world, because we have a very diverse audience. But in general, no matter where you are, the principle of limited finite resources exists. But we also have budget constraints tied into that. And we have this whole push towards new innovation, which tends to be costly. And we have high costs in general that is both competing with our budget constraints and the concept of finite resources. But as we progress too, and there's more innovation in general, we have many competing choices. There's so many options to choose from, which leaves us thinking, how do we manage that? How do we begin to allocate that limited finite resources given what we need to decide on? Now, that's where the whole concept of allocation decisions or allocating resources, right? Regardless of in what country you are in, and regardless of how many resources you have, you still have to make allocation decisions, whether you as an individual, as an institution, as a country, that type of thing. So when we think about allocation decisions, we think about what, how, and to whom are we spending our time and resources, given that current reality. So we answer questions that might seem simple, but are actually very in-depth and difficult to answer sometimes. Questions such as, how much are you willing to pay to solve a problem? How much are you willing to pay to save a life or extend a life for a year? These become much more difficult questions to answer. Questions such as, what should policymakers and society be willing to pay for an additional or incremental unit of health gain? Big questions that require us to systematically break them down in order to better allocate resources. Because like we had mentioned, there's never a blank check in healthcare. No matter how wealthy you are, there are always limitations as to how much you can spend on something. So when you start thinking about allocation decisions, you have to think, how do you objectively decide where to allocate your resources, right? How do you start thinking through what you're going to pay for and what you're not going to pay for? And when you have more information and you're better equipped with better information, then you can more efficiently assign your resources in general. So what does that mean for decision making? Our overarching goal in general should be to provide more objective, evidence-based decision making in healthcare. And to do this effectively, we have to understand our environments and how we're making decisions. If you think about yourself as an individual, are you thinking through about how you're making decisions? Because the decision-making process in general is very multidimensional. Often how you might make a decision on one thing might be very different than how you might make a decision on something else. But thinking about it as in terms of your own decision-making process is very important. So sitting through and thinking, do you evaluate your own decision-making process? And do you evaluate and really understand your decision-making process when it comes to healthcare or specific policies regarding your institution's initiatives? And then this is a question I think we often ask ourselves when we think about decision-making, specifically in the realm when we start to think about the methodology to think about it more objectively, is that you have to constantly ask yourself, are your decisions evidence-based? This is a common question that we have when we think about clinical decisions, and we think about, are we recommending something based off of the clinical evidence, and is that data evidence-based? Now, with the topic of decisions, this book, I go into detail because it is very important as a very general framework and base for thinking about resource allocation. It's the whole decision-making process. And if you see on the right here, there's that whole list of decision criteria, decision models, decision questions, decision rules, decision trees, which goes into the methodology of decision making, as well as thinking about who the decision makers are. So in the book, I go into detail about the various different types of decision makers within healthcare and how it's important to recognize who those are and how diverse they are. I think too, if we even look at the audience right now that we have, people come from very diverse backgrounds and they hold different positions, and they each are decision makers at different points of the healthcare process. So that's very important. Then when we think about, I'm here telling you to think about your own decision-making process. So in the book, I also talk about I also incorporate a decision-making questionnaire, which allows you to evaluate your own decision-making process as well as your institutions. But we'll get into the book in a little bit. But that's just to give you an idea of how important it is when we think about resource scarcity and then decision-making process before we start getting into what are these types of analyses, why we need to think about that. Now, pharmacoeconomics so that's the question here, and we're here to talk about pharmacoeconomics. Pharmacoeconomics is a type of outcomes research, which is a broad, complex, methodological discipline that really looks at the results, the benefits, the real world impact of intervention. So it's very broad within outcomes research. And then you have pharmacoeconomics, which is a type. And then from there, it is also a subtype of health economics because it focuses on the pharmaceutical interventions. It's often used to inform decisions of resource allocation within institutions, like we mentioned. So pharmacoeconomics is really looking at both the pharmaceutical side, so the pharmaceutical products and services, tying that in with the health economic side, which looks at various cost analyses that many public health professionals have. So if you find yourself maybe not within the pharmaceutical space, you still benefit from understanding the different methodology of these cost analyses that are often integrated within pharmacoeconomics, which we'll talk about in a bit. But it's very overarching. It allows you to think about going from the need to effectively and objectively allocate resources to what does that begin to look like, and how do we think about that when it comes to pharmaceutical products and services. Now, greater attention has been shown, we've seen greater attention on pharmacoeconomics in general by looking at the sheer number of pharmacoeconomic analyses that have been conducted over the years and how much the methodology has advanced, necessitating the need to really bring this to light and requiring that more professionals are well versed within this area. Now, the demand to conduct and understand pharmacoeconomic analyses has grown out of the need and pressure by decision makers, professionals, and healthcare providers to quantify and justify the value of products and services provided. So like we mentioned, is that not just you're thinking about the best allocation of it, but you also have to justify why you allocated that. So you need now a specific output that comes as a result. Now, pharmacoeconomic analyses in general allows decision makers to look at both costs and patient health outcomes. So moving beyond the clinical outcomes that we're normally used to. Now, the information generated from these analyses can actually be used on a patient-by-patient level, which I mentioned earlier is something that is interest of mine, but all the way to national policies, which are on much global scale. And depending where you are in the world, you might use these to a greater extent than the other. Now, when we think about pharmacoeconomics in general, where does it play a role? Where do we see it used in? Now, the pharmacoeconomic analysis is not the be-all, end-all, meaning it's not one thing that you are using for all of the decisions you have. It is really a tool that is used in several different areas, such as coverage of policies and benefit design, formulary management, pricing decisions, the drug approval process, developing drug use and treatment guidelines, as well as disease management programs. So there's various different areas in which we use pharmacoeconomics as a tool. There are limitations to these analyses, which I talk a lot about in the book. So recognizing when and where we can use this is very important. Now, in general, this slide here just shows what are some questions that these types of analyses help answer. So in the case, if you're thinking about, is the added benefit of one pharmaceutical product or service worth its added cost? Then you begin to think about, should I conduct one of these analyses, or should I look to evaluate one to help me in my decision-making process? Should we add or remove a medication from the formulary is another common question that we see with the use of these. And also when we think about what are the costs and clinical implications of adding or removing, right? So this is the whole conversation around moving beyond just costs to think about how do we take this information to figure out whether we reimburse for a product or not. And then the same thing applies for a new service. So if you were to add a new service, you also are now, there's different choices that you might have in terms of how you deliver that service, which then begs to differ, is that worth the added cost? Now let's just quickly talk about the book, which is The Art of Pharmacoeconomics. I have it here, right here, so it's just kind of like the size of it. It is the first of its kind book that really takes the macro level approach to the methods, the skills, and the personnel needed to perform and evaluate this type of research. Many of us, you might be sitting and thinking, oh, I don't know when I will be personally doing this type of research. For the most part, if you're thinking about healthcare decision in general, you will be reading literature that looks and talks about cost. Therefore, it's very important it's very important to build the skill sets to do that, to know that if you're adequately evaluating that. What's particularly unique here is when we're talking about the personnel needed. Very diverse stakeholders actually are involved within the whole process. And so understanding that and recognizing that, especially as if you want to do these types of analysis yourself, is very beneficial. It serves as a very easy to read guide to the key elements that go into the whole process of conducting and evaluating. And I want to stress the two parts. So even if you yourself are not conducting it, understanding the various elements that go into this process is very important, even to just try to understand when someone tells you something is cost effective, what does that really mean? And does it mean what it is intended to mean? And you're kind of breaking that down and seeing that. So that's just kind of the overview there. Now, why this book was written, kind of the goals behind it as I was writing it. Now, this discipline, especially for those that are involved in pharmacoeconomics, they know it is a very technical discipline. There are several great organizations that are working within this space, several professionals that are widely published within this space is good, but it is very complex. So the goal is to really simplify a complex discipline to break down the skills gap and competency barriers faced by many healthcare professionals. So more people want to be able to understand what are these various different elements in a much simpler, digestible, foundational way. So this book really serves as an essential beginner's foundational understanding of the various principles and elements so that you can articulate, work on, and evaluate these different types of analyses so that you can see if they would apply to the your own decision-making process. So the hope is that by improving your abilities, you'll be able to understand, interpret, and actually critically evaluate the literature so that we can be able to best utilize the results that many of these analyses are offering into day-to-day decision-making and actually allow for better quality and greater uptake of these analyses when appropriate. But ultimately, when you do read the book, you're going to see the world of healthcare decision-making a little differently because you're integrating multiple aspects that go beyond just clinical. So now just to move a little further along, so the book is broken up into 3 sections and 7 chapters. So these slides here just basically will show you how they're broken up because like I had mentioned, that doesn't just cover the methodology, it goes into the personnel and skills and that type of thing. So section 1 is really more about the decision-making and pharmacoeconomics in general. So that's where you get more of the backgrounds and the concepts of healthcare resource allocation, value, decision-making, and whatnot. So I go into much more detail about the types of analyses to lay the foundation to get a lot more technical through the actual process. Then section 2 goes into designing, conducting, and evaluating pharmacoeconomics. So that's where you're going to go right into designing and curating the experience, thinking about how do we design, conduct these analyses, who to work with and why, who are the different individuals involved, how do you even begin to design your meetings around that, what are certain outputs, and then we go into a very significant tool that was created, which is the Pharmaco-Economic Canvas, which is really a framework of all the different elements in a very easy to read, easy to digest canvas. And then the last part is putting it all together, which provides information just like the summary of the book, references, index, and then empty pages at the end for any notes that you might have. So it's really broken up in a way that basically takes you through the foundational elements of what you need to know, all the way to then let's get specific as to the actual work that it entails, the different model inputs, what you need to do, which is all beneficial whether you read it or whether you create it or just evaluate it. Now, who should read this book? Now, the responsibility to ensure proper use of resources is not limited to any specific healthcare professional. We started off this webinar talking about the significance of resource allocation and how really everybody has a responsibility to appropriately allocate the resources, whether you're a physician, a pharmacist, a healthcare professional, a payer, an institution as a whole, a country, whatever it is positions that you have or whatever decision making you have a responsibility towards that. So really, if you make any decisions in healthcare, which we even do on an individual level, you would benefit from this book. But how it is designed, and we say like how it is state that it is designed for those across the spectrum. So the students, from students to residents to fellows, all the way to healthcare providers and decision makers in these very different settings. Now, okay, sorry about that. Now, also, when you think about who would benefit, ultimately, if you find yourself a lifelong learner and you're really looking to broaden your scope of your skills and build your skills to better inform decisions, tackle the challenges really facing healthcare, and create transformational improvement, you're interested in all these different elements of which this will provide you the structure for that. And then also, like we had mentioned early on, right at the beginning, if you want to utilize more objective measures to inform healthcare decisions, this allows you to create those frameworks and those tools to start thinking about it like that. And then, of course, as many of us are trying to build the skill sets of the current and future needs, this is definitely going to be one, because like I mentioned, at least over the last 10 years, it is substantially grown and has definitely grown over the past 20 or 30 years. Now, for the use of the content of this book, so there's the application as a learner, as in a formal setting. So as a student or in a classroom, I know some of you are professors at a university that are actually teaching these courses. So as someone that has taught this in the university, this is very good for introducing and being a foundational element for that. But it is also really good for those out in practice that are beginning, again, any sort of, wherever decision-making is made in terms of whether it's with patients or institutions, that actually also applies. So whether you're in a formal learning setting, whether it is a classroom, whether it's a residency program, fellowship program, or you are out in practice and making decisions, whether you're in industry, health systems, policy levels, all of these types of applies, because you can do kind of these three buckets with it. You can learn the discipline as pharmacoeconomics and really get background and well-versed. It'll also help you actually conduct and evaluate. So it'll give you the step-by-step process. But then it'll also supplement. So many of you that are well-versed in this field, maybe have been working in pharmacoeconomics for 20 years, this is a great supplement to what you currently have, because there's several different elements that don't exist out there in the literature currently that this adds to. So that's that. I'm just going to take some questions now with regards to the book. I know I went through it very quickly, but it was just to give you kind of an overview of what the book entails. So let me ask some. So we have a comment here. Great job on the book. Hoping more will read and use. Okay, so there's a comment here too about, I'm just finishing a systematic review of cost effectiveness of DSME. We found very few true cost effectiveness analysis. And what's actually also interesting, and then the comment was because we may use the word cost effective loosely. And I think that is very powerful too, that statement there, because oftentimes we hear within, and it's not that it is just pharmacy or just within the healthcare space, people say cost effective very loosely, not recognizing that there's so many inputs and so many elements to actually state whether something is cost effective or not, and then how you define that. So understanding, like we had mentioned a little bit earlier about the decision-making process, decision criteria, decision rules, and then all the model inputs. So going beyond cost, the cost of a product, to recognize what are all the cost inputs that make that. So that is a wonderful point, because I think that is something that we noticed a lot with that. How do we conduct cost benefit analysis for pharmacist-led and make the model scalable to health policymakers? That's a good question. So often with that, I think it just depends on, so there's different elements. So for that question, it has to be broken down in different elements. And so when you're saying cost benefit analysis for pharmacy-led collaboration services, you have to recognize if that is the actual correct analysis for that based off of the outcomes that you want to demonstrate in order to make it scalable. So I say that because oftentimes with cost benefit analysis, we're looking at cost to cost, like the input and output are cost. So recognizing if that from whom perspective, to the health policymakers perspective, what is important to them and how do we build the correct models and inputs that are relevant to the audience. And so within this book, we talk a lot about what are these model inputs and how do we tailor it to the perspective within that. So I think that is really important there when we start to break it down in terms of what goes into these models and what does the health policymaker expect to see in order for it to be scalable and sustainable, because we often think that what our output and what our criteria is could be different than what those healthcare policies. So we go through that in the book. Okay, so there's a question here about, do you cover other aspects of economics of pharmacy practice, or does the book focus on pharmacoeconomics? So the book focuses primarily on the methodology of the different analyses that you can do within pharmacoeconomics. So it depends on what you mean by economics of pharmacy practice. So if you are you thinking about, how you set specific prices and all of that, that's a different realm. This goes into when you have competing alternatives within pharmacy practice, how do you take the economic side and integrate it? Like, how do you think about both costs and the clinical and humanistic outcomes to make a decision? Whereas there's other elements of the economics of pharmacy practice that go beyond this book. So there is a question on, okay, so this is a great question. Do you have any recommendations for a strong academic program that will teach these pharmacoeconomic principles in an applied manner? So it depends. So I think from this question, if you're wanting a specific academic institution that does it, or an actual approach that you do this in a more applied. So there's two folds. This question could go either way in terms of an actual specific academic institution. I think there's many academic institutions that have been teaching this for a while. And then I also, within that, it's not just pharmacy schools that are teaching this, because like I had mentioned, with health economics, the cost effectiveness analysis, cost benefit, all of that, many of them are actually taught in health services research programs, within medical schools, within public health programs, and then even within business schools. So there's different types of approaches. The fact that it's pharmacoeconomics, it generally falls within kind of the pharmacy realm. But if you're looking for structures too on how, what different types of institutions are looking at that, you can kind of diversify within that. But with pharmacoeconomics in general, often the limitation is kind of having these structures that allows it for to be taught in a more applied way. So that's why by creating this canvas, we're able to say, if you take this canvas and you're teaching this to students, you can then integrate all of the research out there. There's different papers, and then begin to assess that if you want more of the application. Okay, and so there's a comment here too. With the current need for transparency, more pharmacists and healthcare providers need to relearn the appropriate research methods and be prepared to share the entire model process. It could be for two pharmacy services. So the point, I think that's also a great point to recognize, that oftentimes when we need a lot of transparency in terms of our methodology or understanding when we come to the conclusion or come to a decision about a particular intervention or the other, that by being able to easily describe what the whole model is and what the whole process is one of the main reasons actually why I wrote this, because it allows people to then take a step back and describe the whole process to someone as you're going in deeper and further. And then with regards to actually specific methods, when you take something that when you're looking at an entire process, you're then much able to hone in on the specific research methodology that you need to build your capabilities in. So let me see if I have anything here on the chat. So there's a great point too here. One of the attendees said, I'm hoping it will help simplify my explanation to non-clinical leaders and physicians. 100%. I think our ability to adequately communicate this. And so there's a whole section too on how we frame this type of information, how we communicate it to those with diverse stakeholders. And so much of it is recognizing who those are and how we best tailor that message. Okay, so there's a question now, can this book tell us how we convert the outcomes available in literature to probabilities? So it does talk about the need in order to do that. Then there's a lot more specifics in which the book will refer you to different resources to allow you to then get much more technical with that. So this is very much of recognizing what you need to know, the branches, and giving you information within that, and then kind of directing you towards additional kind of information that you might need. So, and is there an electronic app for this book? There is not, unfortunately. So I do want to respect people's time. There are few more questions, but we do have a session tomorrow. It is going to be the same exact thing in terms of the information I provide. But if you do have additional questions that you would like to come and ask me yourself, you are welcome also to join as well. The book is available on Amazon if you would like to purchase it. And there's also more information on our website, salusvitegroup.com. If you have any additional questions, also please feel free to contact me at contact@salusvitegroup.com. And then, if you have any additional questions, I hope you all find it very useful and beneficial, and I hope you add it to your toolkit for this specific area. So thank you all very much.